All right, hello guys. We should be live on the YouTube. And yeah, so I'm just making sure all that's good to go, and then we can start up doing the actual stream. So we're gonna be changing up this stream because I did a poll. So maybe I don't know if I'll bring up the poll on the screen, but I did a poll, and it was basically what do you guys like to see on stream the most? And what one pretty resoundingly was like a focused subject, like a particular character or house. That had 64% of the vote. So again, you guys seem like that's what you wanted me to do, which I don't blame you guys. So in this stream, we're going to be doing a Renly like character analysis, and this is going to focus on other characters around Renly, like Stannis, like Robert. This is really going to focus on any characters that partake in Renly's story. So again, if you guys have any questions while we're doing the stream, try to keep it towards like Renly. But yeah, that's what the stream is going to be about. So we're going to go, it's basically like a character analysis that I do like YouTube video wise. So if you've seen, either my Aemond one, my Daemon, I did one for Viserys. It's going to be like that, but just stream format. So I hope you guys like this kind of new format instead of doing, just tier lists or just random Q&As, stuff like that. So yeah, but getting into Renly as a character, he was born in the year 277 AC to Stefan Baratheon and Kasana Estermont. So that is, he was born there. Now, what I think is really tragic about Renly is he is only like, he is literally a baby. Like he's 1 year old when his mom and dad die, which is interesting. So it's like he was born and then they just take off on this adventure to find Rhaegar's, somebody to marry Rhaegar, basically. And unfortunately, they die on their way back from Volantis, and the only survivor is Patchface. What's up? Hi, Ghost. How are you? Hi, Violet. Did you get a haircut? I did get a haircut. I will say it looks like trash right now because I just got done playing some video games with some of my friends who had a headset on, so it looks completely awful right now. But yeah, I just cut the sides down. It's not exactly what I wanted, but it'll do for now. I needed a birthday haircut, really, because my birthday's Wednesday, so I needed to, get it a little figured out. But thank you for noticing, Ashley. So yeah, so Renly, the thing that I like to, well, not like to, because it's very unfortunate, is that Renly grows up in this situation where he doesn't really have a father or mother. He doesn't have a parent. So when we get into Clash of Kings, like POV, and we'll talk about this later when we get to that point of his life, he is someone that was really brought up by Crescent. That's why Crescent feels very responsible for both Renly and Stannis, and that's why that conflict is really jarring for him and why he doesn't really want war, because he himself really raised the two kids. And I think for Stannis, he was more of an independent child, but Renly was this very normal kid. Like, he was a kid that liked to run, play games, and he was seen doing that a lot in Storm's End when he was younger. So, yeah. Well, happy birthday in advance. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you. Appreciate it. But yeah, so that like is kind of the buildup of Renly, is this character that is kind of in an unfortunate circumstance because Stannis is not the older brother that is going to be like a father figure to Renly, if that makes sense. And Renly Baratheon, he goes off to the Vale. Like, so I mean, to me, it's one of those things where Renly's only real family that he had close by would have been Stannis, and we just know Stannis is not that person, right? Stannis is not the best father figure, right? We see with like him and Shireen that like Stannis, he's not the worst father, don't get me wrong, but he's not like the best. Like he's not, seeing her that often. So you do see that Renly kind of grows up in a weird circumstance. And it's also this other idea that I think Renly is someone that is very entitled to a degree and is someone that he doesn't really take no for an answer when you think about it. And he gets all of these pleasantries. Like he's someone that likes to dress really nicely and have these nice silks when he was younger. And I think that a lot is because Crescent didn't really instill into Renly that sense of, okay, you can't get everything you want, right? Because that's the thing, is like, if you are developing a child from a young age and you're a parent, if you let them get whatever they wanted, they're going to come out very entitled. They're going to come out very I will get this and no one's going to tell me no. And it probably gets even worse when you look at Renly, when Robert becomes the king, he's now in the line of succession. So it gets even worse, where no one's going to tell Renly no. Right? Fitting considering he also died under what could be considered weird circumstances. Agreed. There's a lot of like weirdness that goes around Renly as a character, like how he's brought up and how he ends. Very, very interesting ways. So we kind of move forward. Renly grew up in Storm's End, and at the time of Robert's Rebellion, he was very young, right? During Robert's Rebellion, Renly's only 5 to 6 years old. So again, when we see this idea where Stannis talks about, oh, I've worked for everything, I've had to go through all this hardship, and I've earned everything that I've gotten, that's coming from a place of Stannis, was the person in charge during the siege of Storm's End during Robert's Rebellion, where Renly is 5. He's 5 to 6 during this time period. He's just a kid, So when Robert then gives, like later on, Renly Storm's End, you think about it and you go, okay, well, what did Renly do to earn that? Because Stannis sees this as a slight. We understand why Robert wouldn't have thought that was a slight. And we understand why Robert would do it, because somebody had to hold Dragonstone. Someone did. And it's the ancestral home of the Targaryens. You're now arch enemy if you're the Baratheons. You need someone strong to be able to hold it. But Stannis never wanted Dragonstone, right? Stannis wanted Storm's End. He wanted, again, his family home. You have more incomes and you have more power at Storm's End than you do Dragonstone. Dragonstone also, you could see it as, well, Robert was making Stannis his heir, because that's kind of how the Targaryens did things. What I think is interesting is that when Joffrey is born, and when he gets a little older, Joffrey is not given Dragonstone. Like, he's not pronounced the heir and then given that, like the Targaryens had done before that. And then maybe Stannis would have gone back to Storm's End. That never really happens. Stannis was more of the introverted sibling, while Renly was the extroverted sibling. But Stannis did care for his brother, even though it may not... Yes, he did care for him, yeah. And that's one of the things we do see, Stannis has a lot of regret and indecision about his decision to more or less kill Renly. And it's interesting the way that happens, because Stannis and Renly are polar opposites. And that's something we're going to get into in this video, or not this video, this stream, is that they're polar opposites. The two characters fundamentally are just on different sides. Like, if we were going to be a political term, right? They're not directly but it's basically like you're taking two different completely ideologies, personalities, where let's say you have someone that is a far left-leaning, like you're a Democrat, and someone that's a far right, like Republican. It's like that idea where it's like you have two people that are fundamentally completely different, and then we can see how that kind of pushes their conflict. Hi Jesse, how are you? I wonder how Child Renly did during the siege of Storm's End. Probably had to eat his favorite puppy. Yeah, we don't really get a lot into like Renly's experiences during the siege. Like, we don't really see that, and I would be interested to see like what was going on. I mean, I think Renly probably was faring better than most people living in the castle still, but that is an interesting idea. Stannis was named Lord of Dragonstone or Prince of Dragonstone, so Robert wasn't making him his heir, not Prince of Dragonstone. Fair enough, mystery. After Joffrey was born, Robert should have given Storm's End to Stannis and Summerhall to Renly. I could have seen that. That also makes sense, Jesse. That makes sense. So, let's move on. Now, again, like I had talked about, Renly kind of grows up liking bright colors, fabrics. He's this kid that, like, he very much enjoys life. And that's what we see Stannis doesn't really do. Stannis doesn't really seem like he enjoys life, while Renly kind of goes more into the Robert side of it, where he does enjoy a lot of things. He has a lot of pleasantries. But as we'll talk about when Renly gets a little older, they kind of like two different things, where Robert likes whoring, he likes eating, drinking. Those things aren't really things that like motivate Renly, and we know that's probably because Renly is gay, so like whoring is completely different in that regard. I would imagine Stannis made sure Renly was treated better than anyone else during the siege of Storm's End. Probably, and that's another thing that I think probably would go into when Renly declares himself king, and basically that's a betrayal to Stannis. that's another thing that I think is probably a big gut punch for Stannis, where Stannis looks at it where it's like, I did so much to try and keep you, well, treating you better than everybody else in this castle during the Siege of Storm's End, and for that to be repaid with kind of betrayal is another thing that I think Stannis would view on that side of it. And we also see again that at the age of 6, Renly is granted Lord of Storm's End. And again, he becomes a lord very young, right? Very young. And this is something that causes kind of a rift between all 3 of the brothers, not just Renly and Stannis, but Robert as well, when you look at it from Stannis' point of view as well. Another thing that I think we look at with Stannis is, and him being granted Dragonstone, is that Dragonstone, by all accounts, is seen as a very dreary place. Like, it's not this great, happy place. Like, Storm's End is much, like, happier. It doesn't seem like it's just depressing. And it's also this idea, if you're, like, from Stannis' point of view on this, is that, okay, you're living in a place of an ancestral home of another family, and the castle just would feel foreign to someone. I feel like I would feel really uncomfortable if I just slaughtered, or like I helped slaughter someone's entire family line and then took their ancestral castle. It would be really weird. I don't know. I think for me, that would be something that I would be a little on the fence on if I was Stannis. Now, again, we don't have a ton of information in this period. So after kind of the conclusion of Robert's Rebellion to the start of the main story, we don't see like a ton of things about Renly. Like, there's a couple things in here, like we learn that kind of Renly as he gets older, right? He is someone that is able to make friends really easily. He's someone that's very charismatic. He knows how to talk to people. Like, he knows how to gain people's respect and loyalty, which is something Stannis is terrible at, and he struggles at. Again, pointing out the clear-cut differences between the 2 characters, where Renly can do these things. That's why, like, a lot of people, when they point to Renly and Stannis, those 2 characters together, if they had just put their heads together, and let's say Stannis was king or whatever, the 2 would be perfect, because Stannis would counteract all the things that are bad about Renly. Like, he doesn't take things seriously. He's not a great military commander. Those kind of things. Where Renly would then do the opposite for Stannis. Renly would be able to make friends for Stannis. Renly would be able to handle some of these political meetings much better than Stannis would be able to. Now, we see at the age of 16, Renly kind of comes into his manhood, and he does this like royal progress, or progress. I don't know how you say the word, but it's basically what Jaehaerys would do all the time. And in this, he ends up going to Tarth. And this is where we kind of see the idea of Brienne and all these people maybe trying to basically court Brienne. And Renly kind of saves her pride. And this is something, again, that I think separates Renly from maybe even his brothers, where Renly is genuinely, he seems like a kind person. Like, he goes out of his way to dance with Brienne. This doesn't really gain him any favors, right? Maybe it does with the people of Tarth. Maybe they like Renly because of that. But it gains him somebody that, like, Brienne will come to be a huge person that could have helped him in his war efforts. Unfortunately, that gets cut short very quickly. But it's a genuinely nice thing that we see as Renly dances with Brienne, and Brienne kind of basically falls in love with him ever since. And again, I want to note that, like, I don't think Stannis or Robert would have ever done something like that. Like, I don't think either one of those characters, when they were that young, would have gone out of their way to help someone else like that. It's also just a smaller whole. It would be like the King of England granting one brother a huge and giving the other. Yeah, that's the other thing, is that, like, Dragonstone isn't as, like, big. You don't have as much power. Like, Robert giving Stannis Dragonstone limits his power, because Stannis really doesn't have, like we see in Clash of Kings, he doesn't really have that many houses that are, like, sworn to basically him. If I was king, I would definitely want Renly as my master of diplomacy. Yeah, Renly seems like a great, so again, this is for American, like, terms or whatever, but you would want him as, like, a foreign this is not American terms. What am I talking about? But you don't want him as someone that like is going to other countries or other places, making you alliances and making all of that. Because Stannis, if you think about it, like Stannis is he's a terrible person to be in that position. But yeah. Something else we see here that is very interesting. It's like our first real, like, I think time-wise, right? Our first indication that Renly probably is gay is that we see him actually being, or I guess not being, but meeting Arianne Martell. And Arianne Martell even admits, like, she tries to seduce Renly in his youth. And Renly kind of seems bemused or confused by this, hinting at him probably being gay. And I think by all recounts, he probably is. It's not, I guess, confirmed. Like, we, whenever in a scene where we walk in and we see, oh, Renly is with Loras or something like that, like we do in the show. The show basically took what we pretty much believe happened with Renly and just put it on full display, while the books, it's like a Laenor situation, right? With like Rhaenyra. It's like Laenor probably was just gay. But that's what we get here with Renly. I would have gave Storm's End to Stannis and betrothed Renly to Arianne Martell if I was Robert. That would have been a really big power move. Think about it though. If Renly and Arianne get together. Now here's the problem, is Doran. Would Doran have allowed this marriage to happen? Would Doran have been in a position to stop it? Right? Because if Arianne and Renly are married, if you're in Robert's mind, you're shoring up this idea that, okay, the Dornish were not exactly too happy about what happened with Elia and her children. This is a good position to maybe try to fix that problem, right? Now, the question then would be, like we said, would Doran have allowed it? Would he have made some excuses? Because again, Viserys and Arianne had a secret pact. Well, Doran had the pact made for them, but there was a secret pact for that. So it would be interesting if that was to happen. And yes, Jesse, the words I was looking for earlier, Secretary of State. Yes. But moving on. So we also see directly after this, while Renly is at Storm's End, he eventually takes Loras Tyrell as a squire. And it's widely known by many people at court that they would later note that Renly and Loras were probably lovers. And I think it makes sense by the actions we see with Loras later on, where we hear, again, this will go on later in the video, but Loras personally buries Renly in a place that only the two of them really like knew back in the day. So I think everything would point to them having a relationship, but it's not exactly confirmed. So, we'll continue. Now, the last thing we see before kind of the main story picks up. And also, I wanted to note, Paul, thank you. I thank you for saying great content. I forgot to respond to that. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. But the last thing we kind of see is that Renly, basically, he appoints Sir Courtney Penrose to rule in his stead. We also note that Edric Storm, one of Robert's bastards, is being raised here. So very similar to Renly, where Edric Storm, like his parents, like Robert, absent in his life for the most part, he is basically being raised by other people. So again, very similar. Like there's very similar beats to Edric that there are to Renly. They're very similar in that regard. And also, Renly is named a Master of Laws and is appointed to the Small Council. And that kind of gets us mainly into the main story. And I want to kind of talk about Renly's appearance for a second. So Renly is kind of described as being the spitting image of Robert at a young age. Like, there are multiple times that we see his description, whether that's from Ned, or whether that's from Catelyn, saying, wow, he literally looks just like Ned. Or not Ned, just like Robert. So, again, it kind of shows into where Stannis doesn't get this, right? Stannis does not look exactly like Robert and Renly. Like Stannis is balding, and he doesn't have kind of the handsome features that Robert and Renly have. Again, pointing into Stannis' resentment is that Renly is handed all of these physical features and traits that he just doesn't have. And I think that's a lot of the things we look at when we look at Stannis, is that Stannis kind of looks at Renly and says he's had everything handed to him. He hasn't really had to work for anything or put himself in a position, right? The fact that the younger brother is promoted over the older one must have... Yes, Stannis definitely was not a fan of a lot of moves that Robert did make. We also see that Renly is very handsome, tall, long black hair, broad shoulders, chest. Again, the spitting image of Robert. Another thing that, again, separates Renly and Stannis, because they are kind of our two main characters that interact, I think, with Renly's story, is the idea that Renly dresses very richly. Like, Renly is not someone that, like, is hiding his wealth or is humble. He flaunts his wealth. Like, he's kind of like, okay, so Tywin. When we see Tywin in battle, right? He is someone that dresses, I guess I wouldn't say battle, because he really overlooks the battle, right? But he dresses very, like, nicely. Like, you can tell he is rich. He's got layered in gold. That's kind of how Renly is. Renly very much dresses like a rich person. Like, he flaunts his wealth. Hey guys, hey Grease. Sorry I'm late, but I got my tea. I unfortunately do not have tea for this stream. I finished a game with my friends like literally 5 minutes before the stream, so I didn't have a lot of prep time. But, you know, I wish I could have seen Stannis with Robert. Yeah, it would have been interesting to have seen more interactions between the two characters, like, specifically. But we just don't really see it, which is unfortunate. It's really unfortunate we don't see Stannis at all in book 1. We only hear about him, which is something that is done much better in the books than the show. Because in the show, Stannis feels like this character, like, that's just thrown out of left field. Like, we have, like, some throwaway lines in season 1 about Stannis, but we don't really know who he is as a person. Right? We have no idea who Stannis is. In the book, it's very well told to us by the time we get to Stannis' character, who he is as a person, and kind of his ideologies, and all of that. We just don't see that in the show, and very missed opportunity. Get yourself a tea. I'll be fine. I'll be fine, Matthew. Also, if I was gonna do that, I usually like make hot tea. It would probably take me like a good like 5-10 minutes. But yeah. All right. We also see that Renly is someone that likes tourneys, and he does like hunting, but he isn't motivated by the things that like Robert is motivating. Like I talked about at the beginning of the stream, like Robert's pleasantries are different than Renly's pleasantries, which I think is an interesting idea. Renly also, so another thing that makes Renly very dangerous to someone like Cersei is Renly becomes very popular in King's Landing. So think about it like Daemon, where Daemon kind of becomes popular in King's Landing or he's popular to some, unpopular to others. But Daemon becomes a threat because of the popularity and also controlling the Golden Cloaks. Renly is kind of the same way, where he is very popular. Like, people really like Renly. He, like we talked about earlier, very charismatic. He is someone that's, again, handsome, dresses richly. He plays the role of a prince, right? Like, Renly basically plays like he is the person that's going to become king after Robert. So it's an interesting idea that he does that, where Stannis is completely the opposite. Stannis dresses very plainly. But yeah, it's kind of another thing I feel like the show in season 1 with Renly's character didn't quite get down Renly. I feel like in season 2 they got his look down much better. Like, he definitely looks the part. Season 1 he didn't really give me that vibe. I can definitely see that, Joel. Yes, he was a very good diplomat, Dan. And that's the thing, is like Renly shouldn't have been king, I don't think, but he should have been someone in that role of a diplomat. If Renly didn't die when he did, do you think he could have won the war? Okay, Violet. I am a firm believer that if certain things had changed, Renly would have won easily. Because the idea here is, if Renly, let's say he just, okay, for instance, we're going to get to a point that I want to debate on stream, because I think it's a very interesting point of the story. If Renly had just simply not gone to Storm's End and just avoided Stannis as a whole, and just kept going to King's Landing, he would have won. Like, there's no doubt he wins. Like, he has way more soldiers, way more power than Stannis has. Like, yes, granted, Stannis is a fantastic military commander. There is no way King's Landing is holding. And the other thing here is that, again, remember, the main plan of Tywin's wasn't actually to go to King's Landing. His plan was to actually go back west, and because Edmure stops him, well, this gives him now the option to kind of go down. And also, he has this whole alliance that is brought to him kind of by Littlefinger. So that whole idea there gives him a reason to go to King's Landing. So in my opinion, I think Renly wins easily. Like, I don't see any way he is stopped unless Stannis does a shadow baby from Storm's End all the way to where his camp is from that distance. I don't know. The show did not get any characters right. I think they got some characters right that like were early season characters or characters that didn't get to the later parts. Like Ned, I think they did Ned fairly well. Ned is younger in the books, but still did a pretty good job for the most part with his performances. Oberyn, I think, is another character that did pretty well. Tyrion, they did pretty well until kind of like season 4. Like, I think the Tysha mission kind of ruined that, but also, Ashley, hope you feel better. Renly was this character that is basically just like Robert, and he is described as having the huge shoulders and chest, so he's definitely jacked. He had the biggest army and the most resources by far, yes, because you got to think, like, he had majority, if not all, of the Stormlands and the Reach behind him. Like, he just had enough to do it. Renly could have taken King's Landing, but Stannis would have been still sending a shadow assassin. Yes, that is a possibility. And that's my thing is, like, here's my question, right, guys? How, like, so the shadow assassin, how close or in proximity do you have to be for those to work? Like, could Stannis have theoretically, like, seen Renly take over King's Landing and then gone, all right, Mel, time to kill him. And then, like, they just make a shadow baby, like, around Storm's End, and it, like, I'm interested to see, like, how that would have worked. Renly had well over 100,000 men. If he really didn't play at war and actually wage war, he would have won. So this is something that I think is interesting. When we get to that part of the story, there's the idea here that Renly was doing that for a reason, right? It wasn't bad strategy or that he was playing at war. Renly's strategy, which in my opinion, I can see why he did this, right? Is he was basically letting the Starks and Lannisters kill each other. Is more or less what his plan was. So more or less what Renly was doing is he was gaining more people, right? He was, because again, this kind of camp was just attracting more people. His thought process was, well, I'm going to blockade King's Landing. They're not going to get any food. As they starve and get more desperate, they're going to turn against their defenders, and they're going to want me to be king. That's what I would assume his thought process was for King's Landing. And the other idea, again, it goes back to, at this point, we have to remember, Robb was kicking Tywin's ass. And at this point, Tywin looked like he was going to be going into the west, where there was going to be some sort of confrontation with Robb. He only gets stopped because Edmure stops him. So the Lannisters had been getting bloodied pretty good. And the whole idea is, you got to remember that Renly also, at this point, thinks of the Starks almost as enemies. Like, just like Stannis. Because they are taking part of his kingdom, and they're seceding. So, again, I see why Renly did that. I do think it probably was a better idea to just take King's Landing right away, and just not do that, because then once you have King's Landing, you can then, you know, use that. But I don't know. Let me get back to the comments. Stannis' actor and demeanor was really good, but they blew it narrative. Yes. I completely agree with you on that, Paul. No problem, Ashley. Ned is younger and better dressed, as are all the Starks. I would agree. I think the Starks as a whole dressed far better than Stannis did. Stannis was one of those people that you know in your life that just didn't care about their, like, look. Or not, I got their looks, but their clothing. Renly, his terms to Robb seem fair. I agree. I mean, just Renly's position at this point, Renly had far more resources and military backing, where he basically says, yeah, Rob, you can keep saying you're king of the North, but you're not, like, the Seven Kingdoms are still part, or you're still part of the Seven Kingdoms, and you're going to have to bend the knee to me. That's very fair, in my opinion. And then Renly helps you basically clear out the Lannisters. I personally think that's fair. But pride is a unfortunate thing. Does the Red Keep have the magic of Storm's End? That's a great question, Jordan. That's a great question. It was more the fear of the Force than the Force itself. Exactly, Peter. And that's another thing, is a lot of the soldiers within that army, and this is something I'm going to talk about later when we get into Clash, is that a lot of the soldiers in that army hadn't really been tested. They'd only been in tourneys. Like, when you think about the Reach, right? The Reach as a whole really wasn't involved in the war. They were sieging Storm's End, which was whatever. So, again, I think you look at it, and they really were the Knights of Summer, or the Army of Summer. Okay. I mean, Stannis did have Melisandre smuggled near the camp, so maybe you have to be close to the person you want to assassinate for it to work. Yeah, and Ghost, this is my problem, because if I'm Renly in that situation, I take King's Landing, I'm not even bothering going to Storm's End or to Stannis, right? Because I don't want to be a kinslayer. I would just send someone like Randyll Tarly with an army that vastly, like, just takes out Stannis and say, yeah, Randyll, negotiate on my terms. If he says no, then you have to kill him. And then you have the whole idea, okay, well, what does Stannis do now? Because even if he eliminates Randyll, you're not any further to your goal. So, I don't know. It's an interesting idea there. Rob should have let Edmure in on his plan. He should have. It was a massive, just massive blunder. Your Lord Grease. What do you think about Shadow Bays as a thing in the story? Song of Ice and Fire is masterful, but the Shadow Bays are a little mid for me. Yeah, so the Shadow Babies are an interesting idea because you can really see them as a plot device to a degree, because Renly has this unstoppable army. There's no way Stannis is beating him. So there has to be some reason for that to kind of flip on its head. And then when you see later on when Stannis can't make any more Shadow Babies, it kind of feels, I will say, it kind of feels a little cheap. It's like, okay, now Stannis' life force is too gone. You know, I get why George put it in there, because something had to happen if you wanted Renly to die. He needed it to make sense, and there wasn't a lot of ways you could do that just based upon Renly's army. That's what Stannis should have done, and assassinate Renly later in the war when the Lancers were defeated. Yeah, he could have done that as well. And that's the other thing, is like, Stannis could have just sat on Dragonstone for a while. Now, the problem with him just kind of staying out of the war is less and less people come to his side. Like, people just kind of forget about him because he's not doing anything during the war. But say Stannis had known the entire time that he could just use a Shadow Baby and kill Renly. Stannis, theoretically, could have just waited till the Starks, Lannisters dealt with each other, Renly takes the throne, and then Stannis just goes to King's Landing and just does a Shadow Baby and kills him. It's possible. Drink some ginger. Oh, okay, you're okay. Ginger tea does sound good, I will say. How would Renly have done as king in your opinion? I think Renly would have done a fair job. I don't think Renly, like, okay, if we look at the best people to rule Westeros, or I guess to be the king, I think Renly would be solid. But I think the problem with Renly is, I don't know how to put this. I don't think Renly would have taken the job as serious as it needed to be. Right? Like, I don't think he was the right person. And I think the best person for the kingdoms is a mix of Stannis and Renly's personality. Because, yes, Renly is a kind person. He shows that he does care about the people, right? And that would have been a great aspect of Renly. But I think Renly also shows, during his, whether that's in his small council meetings or this or that Renly is willing to do things that are just not honorable, to where Stannis on the opposite end would do those things. So I think a good mix of Stannis and Renly would be the perfect king. He says Rob can call himself king of the North if he bends the knee a very, yeah. It's yeah, Joel basically is making the point here that it's basically like the Targaryens and the Dornish, where the Dornish, like, they still have princes and stuff like that, right? Even though, you know, they're not. Like, they're not really, like, in charge of those seven kingdoms or anything. It's basically, it basically is exactly what Joel just said. Renly would not be able to handle Dany or young Griff. Stannis on the throne could handle them. I agree with that, Peter. I agree. Because the issue here would be, I think it would be a tough sell for Stannis to even kind of handle Dany. I think young Griff Renly could have handled. I think Renly could have handled, because you gotta remember, Renly still does have people like Randall Tarley. Right? So I do think that Renly could have dealt with young Griff. Now, what I don't think he could have dealt with was Dany. I think the dragons are just a big thing. I guess Nightbot does not like you, Leo. Oh, man, the full title, live Renly. Yeah, it's I didn't realize it cut that off. You know what I really hate though? So when I was putting the stream out, basically, or like earlier today when I was putting the title out, I was putting all this and I was putting the stream out so you guys could like just see, you know, when it would be up. It didn't change the title. So I had the Renly thumbnail, but the title was like Jaime Lannister, like character analysis, because that's my preset. That's my preset for like YouTube. So it like fills that in before I upload a video, and then I just change it. It didn't change that. I had saved it and it didn't change it. So that was kind of weird. Renly as king and Stannis as hand would have been a great combination, but neither would go for that. A victory, even Robert would. Yeah, I think either way. I think Renly as king or Stannis as king and the other one as hand would have been pretty good, as long as they were willing to listen to each other. But yeah, my thing with Dany is she does have dragons, and I don't think Renly or Stannis could have dealt with that. Yeah, that's the other thing, Paul, that I think a lot of people talk about, is that Renly theoretically could have just bent the knee here. And because Stannis doesn't have any sons, and it doesn't seem like he's going to have any in the future, Renly quite possibly could have become king anyway. That is a good point. He would have won if not for magic, but his facing Tywin and Stannis, great channels that would bloody him and probably leave him more evenly matched with Robb. So, Joel, my counter argument to that is that Tywin was much more involved with Robb than he would have been with Renly. Because, to me, I just think with Robb being in the Westerlands, that's more personal to Tywin. And I think Tywin would have just seen as King's Landing was a lost cause. Because I just, like, let's say Tywin does this big long march all the way back to King's Landing while Renly's sieging it. What's that going to accomplish? I just don't see. I think Renly would have just defeated Tywin then. Now your point could be that, okay, now Renly is a bit weakened a little. Maybe that makes him more of a match for Robb. But I don't know. How much do you think the Tyrells would have exerted their influence over Renly, especially considering the debt to the Iron Bank and faith? Oh, I think they were already doing it. I mean, if you look at who would have been on Renly's small council, it would have been a ton of Tyrells. Tyrells basically put Renly on the throne. He was married to a Tyrell. He was having another love relationship with Loras. He was definitely heavily involved with the Tyrells, and I think they would have had a strong influence on him, which I don't think is even a bad thing. Right? Like, people like Cersei think it's a terrible thing that the Tyrells are getting a bunch of power and stuff. But the kingdoms would probably be doing pretty well under the Tyrells' control. In my opinion, the time of the Targaryens is over. I would totally fight for Stannis against Dany. See, Ghost, that's an interesting question. Or I guess an interesting thought, because I think if you're an average person in Westeros, I think you wouldn't like Dany. Like, exactly, this is one thing I did like about Season 7 for Game of Thrones, is that Cersei does make the argument that Dany is this foreign invader. She has foreign armies. Like, I think as a person, like a common person in Westeros, you would kind of see it that way. Like, if she's bringing over a Dothraki army, an unsullied army, she does seem like a foreign invader. The dragons will bend the knee or Stannis will destroy them. Exactly. Even Renly changed the Baratheon banner to the Tyrell colors. This is true. All right, let's move on. Okay. So getting into a Game of Thrones. Renly is a character that in a Game of Thrones, he doesn't have a major role, but he does like have his influence. Like he's still a part of it. And what I think is really interesting and something I hate about the show is the show takes away Renly during like Arya Joffrey's conflict where Nymeria bites Joffrey. The whole like idea of, oh, you let a little girl disarm you. All of that comes from Renly. That is not at all by Robert. And I hate that they gave that to Robert. It was so Renly in that moment. And Renly, just being Renly, laughing at Joffrey, poking fun at Joffrey. We know Joffrey and Renly's relationship was not good. And this is just kind of foreshadowing of that. He basically gets, exiled out of the hall. And this is kind of like think about it from a Game of Thrones, like you're reading it. This is our first like introduction into Renly outside of his meeting with Sansa. It kind of paints exactly who he is as a person, right? He kind of enjoys poking fun at people. He enjoys like that kind of stuff. And another thing that they removed from Renly in the show is that Renly actually participates in the turning for the hand. He's not one of the spectators, right? He is involved in it, and he apparently does pretty well until he unfortunately gets defeated by the Hound. His part in Littlefinger's coup, a suggestion to Ned, it would be Renly running the kingdom. Yeah. Because this would have been an interesting idea as well, is like Renly basically tells Ned, we need to get Cersei, we need to get all of these people, they got to get imprisoned. Okay, we're going to talk, we'll just hit that part now, right? Renly then probably would have made himself king. He would have condemned all these people, and he would have had the backing, right? Ned wouldn't have been able to really stop him in this situation. And if you're looking at it from Littlefinger's perspective, who does he back? Renly or Ned? It's quite clear that Littlefinger would have backed Renly. So Ned was in a very precarious situation because in either way, he probably loses. Like Ned's best bet at this point, as soon as Robert kind of dies, would probably have been to have just left. I just don't understand why Renly didn't go through his plan to take the castle of the night, even without Ned's approval. So I think the idea is that Renly wanted more swords to do that. He could have had part of Ned's guard, the remaining parts of Ned's guard, added to Renly's soldiers as well. Yeah, and that's something that Renly does mock Shireen, which I think is a horrible sentiment, which is one of those things that's like, it's a really weird thing because it's like Renly appears kind to a lot of characters, but then in certain regards, when he's just trying to mock Stannis, make Stannis angry, he goes so far as to calling his niece like deformed, basically. He's a very interesting character. And another part that we, again, don't see at all in the show, there's a lot that they cut out with Renly's character in season 1, is that Renly shows basically a painting of Marjorie to Ned. And he basically is like, hey, Ned, does this look like your sister? And then he's like, no. Right? And so the whole idea here was Loras and Renly basically thought, okay, if she looks like Lyanna, or Marjorie looks like Lyanna, it'll make it way easier to do this idea of deposing Cersei, putting Marjorie into power. Because again, Robert's madly in love with Lyanna and still is, or I guess the idea of her anyway. And it kind of shows, again, another plot that was going on, that Renly was already in bed with the Tyrells, trying to get Marjorie on the throne, or at least the queen. It shows that Renly was trying to manipulate who was on the throne much earlier than even Robert's death. With Renly being attracted to men, what do you think would happen in regards to that if he became king? Would the faith accept that? So I think it would have been one of these situations where the faith can't really do anything. They don't have proof that he likes men, right? And it's also the idea that, okay, Renly is married to Marjorie. Marjorie herself is part Hightower. So I think the faith would have been fine with it. And also Renly just took it by conquest. They don't have swords or anything to say no to Renly. I still can't believe Renly and Loras thought that bull would work. Yeah. Bright and shiny, but not worth too much indeed. Yes. After the painting, Ned thought Renly was a bit of an odd weirdo. Well, wouldn't you? Some guy walks up to you and he's like, "Hey, does this look like your dead sister?" No. Oh. Okay. Oh. Like, it's just a weird interaction. Like, especially for Ned, where he doesn't really understand like what Renly is plotting or anything like that. And we also see another thing where Renly is not this morally high ground guy like Ned. When they're at the small council figuring out if they should assassinate Dany, Renly's like, yeah, why not? It shows the differences between a character like Renly and Ned in that regard. Regardless of being gay, Renly probably would have had children anyway. Sadly, he was probably the best hope to stop House Baratheon from going into extinction. That is correct. Unless someone like Edric Storm does get, what's the word I'm looking for? A Maid of Baratheon. There's a word I'm looking for in there, but Maid of Baratheon more or less by someone, which is very possible. Maybe young Griff could do that. Maybe that could be something that we see. The Marjorie marriage plot would have failed. The High Septon wouldn't annul. So this is where I actually disagree, Mystery. If Renly had presented a case that Cersei had slept outside of the marriage, had incestuous kids, and committed high treason, it wouldn't have mattered, because I think Robert would have killed Cersei. That's the way it would have happened. And also, again, we have to remember, Marjorie is part Hightower. So the Faith that are in bed and, you know, all of everybody in Old Town, legitimized, that's what I was looking for, thank you, are in bed with the Tyrells already. So there could have been some manipulation there to get a Hightower / Tyrell on the throne. Yes, a lot of houses are kind of on the edge. I know this is about Renly, but if Stanley had a different wife, I think he would have had more children. I agree, because by all accounts, Stannis' wife is not attractive. Like, she just isn't. And she also kind of seems a little psychotic. Her personality seems bad. Stannis got a real shit marriage. If you guys want to see more of an breakdown of that, I did a video on that relationship, but it's a bit, you know, Renly is a little more evil and less snobbish than Ned. I agree. Typical Martin moral greatness. I agree. Did Renly know the whole bastard and twincest thing at the point, though? That's a great question. Now, again, we're left up to speculation, Mystery. So that was my speculation. Personally, I think Renly had to have known. I think Renly is a smart enough guy and shows enough political intrigue, or not political intrigue, but enough political savviness that he would have figured it out. I just think that I think he probably did. Personally. Maybe I'm wrong, though. He's not as weird as with women as he appears, which we see from his interaction with Asha. If his wife wasn't deranged, he might have been more open to intimacy. I agree, Ashley. I agree. I definitely see your point there. All right. So, after this whole debacle of should Ned basically imprison all the children and Cersei, Renly, seeing kind of where the chessboard's going and how it's shifting, leaves and flees to go to Highgarden with Loras. And there, they basically marry him to Marjorie, and they crown him king of the 7 kingdoms with the support of the Reach and later the Stormlands. And that gets us into Clash. Now, we've talked a lot about Clash, but we're going to kind of continue there. Damn, Robert's whole small council knew that the Cersei's children weren't Robert's and nobody told him. Yeah, it's one of these ideas where it's like Robert's so blind, but everybody around him kind of, I feel like, knew. And the problem was everybody knew, but they needed proof. That was the rough part. And that was the thing that was like, a lot of people could have their suspicions. I'm not even saying maybe Renly knew for certain, but having proof was the thing. Because, again, Renly does not have the tie to Robert that Ned does. And that's why Cersei is so scared of Ned. Because if Ned goes to Robert and says, your children, they're all bastards, They're Jaime and Cersei's. Just look at their hair. Robert would be way more inclined to believe Ned, someone he considers way more of a brother, someone that he knows would never lie to him or do something like that that's dishonorable, over someone like Renly, who we've seen be politically savvy. We know Renly and Robert are not as close as someone like Ned. It'd be much more of a tougher sell, and especially when you look at Stannis. Stannis has even a worse relationship. He would have to be able to, without any refute, without any breaks in his evidence, be able to prove that Joffrey and the rest of them were not his. I feel like most in King's Landing knew except Robert. That's a fair point. Well, and Gendry didn't know too. This is correct. What if Renly and Stannis both starved to death at Storm's End? That would be interesting, because my question then with that one be, Joel, would be, how would Robert handle that? Because then Mace Tyrell would be directly involved with the killing of both of his younger brothers. Would anything have come from that? Like, would Robert have looked for some sort of vengeance, or would he have just chalked it up to war? And I can definitely see that Robert may have just let it go and just chalked it up to war. Like, basically what he does for, like, the end, when King's Landing is sacked, basically just chalks it up to, it's war. Kids die. I just want to tell you that I love these streams, my man. Super fun. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoy it, Leo. I chose Renly for like our first stream character analysis because I really like Renly's character. I like how George built two opposite characters, because Stannis is my favorite character. So when you look at the opposite of that, I also think it's very interesting because that impacts who Stannis becomes and who he is at the main story. The War of the Five Kings would have been a lot shorter. Yep. Renly and Stannis telling Robert would just look like, yeah, that's the other thing. So, like, that's my thing, is that, like, Renly and Stannis, to be able to do that plot, basically, would have needed concrete evidence that was irrefutable. Like, they would have had to have almost caught Jaime and Cersei in the act for it to have really gotten through. Maybe Jon Arryn would have been able to convince him, like Jon Arryn and Stannis, maybe it would have happened, but yeah, you guys are exactly right. Jaharis, you are exactly right on that entire situation, and that's why it took so long for that to kind of roll over. It's another reason Littlefinger needed Ned in King's Landing after Jon Arryn dies, because that could forward it a lot easier. And also, it creates more conflict. If Stannis and Renly had done it like that, there wouldn't have been that much conflict. So, let's look at the ideologies of why Renly believes he could take the throne over his brother. So Renly's whole ideology here is that, well, one, I can take it by conquest. I have the largest army, the most resources. I am the most well-equipped to win a war. So he basically goes off of the Robert Baratheon idea of conquest. Now, Robert Baratheon also has some Targaryen blood, so he also kind of justified it using that. But Renly basically just straight up goes, I am more liked, the people love me more than you, Stannis, and I have a bigger army than you. So therefore, I can become king because I can just do it. And yeah, that's kind of his whole thing. Now his hand of the king is Mace Tyrell. And also, the person in charge of his Kingsguard, the quote-unquote Rainbow Guard, is Loras. So again, we even see just in this moment here, the Tyrells had a lot of influence on Renly's camp. They were in very powerful positions. And again, as I talked about, so I want to debate this with you guys. I kind of talked about it a little bit, is Renly, do you guys think he was right in taking his time slowly moving through the Reach? Or do you think he should have just gone for King's Landing? Because again, like I noted in my notes here, Renly was trying to basically bleed all the other powers out besides his. Right? He is assuming that if he just stays out of it, he will gain in power, so he'll go up. Everybody else losing battles, winning battles, whatever, they're going to go down. The people of King's Landing, their morale is going to go down, causing unrest, which is something that does happen. There start being riots in King's Landing, like we see. there starts to be just unrest. People are starting to turn on the Lannister regime. That was his whole thing, right? He was wanting all that to happen, and then he would just basically swoop in without much of a contest. So I don't know. What do you guys think there? Do you think he should have just taken King's Landing, or do you think his thought process wasn't terrible here? Or maybe that was what he should have been doing? I would like to know who was Master of Law before Renly. I'm not sure on that, Joel, but that is an interesting question. Picture this. What if a War of the Five Kings ever happened? I don't see too many what if scenarios on this idea. So if the War of the Five Kings never happened, so let's just say the way the War of the Five Kings doesn't happen, there's like one major one where it's basically Robert is still alive. He doesn't die to the boar. Cersei gets beheaded. The children are either killed or sent into exile or something. Probably killed. They're probably killed. If Robert, yeah, they're probably killed. And then, so Tywin then goes into open rebellion. That's just going to happen. So you would still have a war. It just wouldn't be a bunch of factions. It'd be everybody against Tywin. The Lannisters would lose. Unfortunately, they would just lose. They're not standing up against the entire country. Like, even the Dornish would be like, oh yeah, great, we get to kill some Lannisters. I'm on board. So, I don't know. I mean, if in that scenario happens, the next question would be, would Dany survive? Because Robert Baratheon already put one assassination attempt on Dany. Would he have been able to eventually get her killed? Because once Robert learns that, oh, she has dragons now, he's definitely going to want to kill her. So, I think it's actually much more likely Dany actually does die in this situation. But who knows? So then the idea here would be, okay, so there would pretty much just be peace. Marjorie would then be married to Robert, probably. I don't know how you would cause a conflict. So then you'd probably have the entire, if Dany is killed, you would have the entire continent more or less united against the others when they come over. So you would assume, more than likely, they would stand a pretty good chance, especially with Ned still being alive in this situation. Robert and Ned being a very good relations. Robert would come to Ned's aid if he needed it. Maybe there's the young Griff plotline, but young Griff just doesn't have, he's not a big enough threat to threaten the rest of the kingdoms at this point, with everyone united. So, in my opinion, it goes much better. So basically, Renly would win the popular vote while Stannis would win the Electoral College. Yes. Yeah, I would have done the same thing. You cannot know about the damn Shadow Baby. Yeah. Just go for King's Landing, give Tyrion no time to retire, no wildfire, a plot, kill Joffrey and Tommen. Waiting gained him nothing. So, it's tough to look at this mystery because here's the idea. Because Stannis, the wildfire thing still wouldn't have actually mattered that much in this situation. But the question would have been, Renly would have probably waited even longer than when Stannis actually does attack. So would the city have eaten itself alive? And the other question would have been, so let's say Tywin with his given this extra time, would Tywin then have gone back to King's Landing to reinforce it? If he had had more time? I don't think so. I just don't see it. Right? So then what we'd see here is, if all of the Lannister force, right, with Tywin is in the south, Robb basically just has the free reign of the Westerlands. I just don't see that happening. I don't know. It's an interesting idea, though. After Robb's crown and Rickon are princes, why are Renly and Stannis only lords? Well, okay, so the idea here would be, so you have a good point here, Joel, when the war, when Robert first gets crowned, why aren't Renly and Stannis princes? That's a great question. Later on it would be because, well, they don't have kids. So, or Robert has kids, so then they're just uncles now. They're further down the line. But that is a great question. Do you think the Tyrells are working with Renly equally, or were they manipulating? Okay, well, they were really just manipulating Renly. Is really what it came to. They were manipulating Renly to take the throne. Renly would not have gotten those ideas into his head to become king without the Tyrells. That's a good point, Matthew, of how close Stannis was to taking it. That's a great point. I think taking King's Landing basically furthers his own claim. So I do think it's probably a good power move. It's kind of like taking King's Landing for, okay, House of the Dragon spoiler. House of the Dragon spoiler, so if you don't want a House of the Dragon spoiler, you know, do your thing. Just, this is your warning. With Rhaenyra taking King's Landing, it makes the green side look more illegitimate because they're not on the throne. Or if Joffrey and Tommen are actually legitimate, that's true. That's another thing. If they're actually legitimate, you don't really have another conflict. So again, you're good there. But the question would be, when Joffrey becomes king, what part of Joffrey do we get? Like, what version of Joffrey do we get? If he's actually a Baratheon, is he a different person, or is he still a psycho? Interesting. I don't think Dany will be able to defeat Renly Baratheon's Highgarden army. People often forget how tiny their dragons are and how massive Aegon's dragons were. That's a good point, but here's the thing. By the time Dany's going to come over, because you have to think, like, we're still, you know, Dany still hasn't come over in the main story now. They're still going to be very sizable, and Dany still is probably going to have a very sizable army. Right? She's probably going to have, you would assume, some Dothraki when she's done with that whole plot. The Unsullied. She's going to have a solid army with her and 3 full-grown, or not full-grown, but 3 sizable dragons. Do you think the United Westeros could have beaten the others without dragons? Violet, I don't... See, here's the thing. I don't know. Because I don't know to what degree the others would be a threat against that. Like, is dragons needed for that? I just don't know. I'd like to say probably no, but I don't know. What religion would you follow if you were in A Song of Ice and Fire? I've always said that if I was in A Song of Ice and Fire, I would want to live in the Reach. So I would probably have to just go with 7, just based off of proximity. And they're basically like, I would say like they're like the common religion of Westeros. So they would be kind of like the equivalent of Christianity in like our world. That's kind of like the common religion. So I'd probably go with the 7. Without the 5-year time skip, how are Dany's dragons going to be large enough for her to ride? It's not mentioned that it will take years for it to be so. I think you just chalk it up to... I think what George could do is just be like, yeah, Dany's dragons, they just were able to eat a ton. And also, they just have some good genes. Because, again, that is a great question you bring up. Like, the 5-year gap does impact things like the size of the dragons. Makes sense, mystery. That could be what. That would make sense, though. So, we then have, more or less, we get to Catelyn going to Bitterbridge. These are some of my favorite chapters, by the way. Catelyn with Renly and like the whole Stannis plot is actually some of my favorite chapters of Clash. Basically gets sent there, and we've talked about kind of the alliance here that was going to happen, possibly with Renly and Robb. And again, Renly is shocked. He didn't expect Stannis to start besieging Storm's End, and that's where Renly goes to go. Now, the question, again, here, there's another question is, put yourself in Renly's position, so don't have any knowledge of what's going to happen. If you're Renly, do you think you needed to deal with Stannis now at Storm's End, or should you have just continued towards King's Landing? Should you have just ignored Stannis? Because when you think about it, it's exactly what Robert did in Robert's Rebellion. Storm's End is getting, sieged. It's the last thing. It's like the last thing that gets resolved. Robert basically just ignores it. So, do you guys think, I want chat, comments, people watching, do Do you think Renly should have even bothered with Storm's End? Or do you think he should have just gone to King's Landing? Probably the blood magic. That's another way you could explain it. I feel like Drogon has the potential to be another Balerion because of how big he is growing, or how fast he's growing. Yes, definitely. I can definitely see that. But yeah, let me know what you guys think about that, because I personally am a believer that Renly didn't need to go to Storm's End. I think Renly could have just as easily just ignored Stannis and kept going, and then just sent forces there at some other point. Because we see, like, how accursed kinslaying is, right? So Renly personally going to Storm's End is setting himself up to be a kinslayer. And I think you could have just had somebody else go there and fix that out. Now, the problem here is that Stannis is a very good military commander, so there is always that danger. And also, he is posing as another king at this moment. There is the idea that, okay, if you leave this untouched, Stannis is a dangerous person. He gets advised that. That's one of the reasons why he goes there, because people advise him that he needs to wrap up this whole this whole Stannis problem, because it could come back to bite you in the ass. Which is funny, because him going there is what bites him in the ass. But, I don't know. You guys seem like we're agreeing on the King's Landing route. I think it's just the smarter plan. I just don't think Renly had anything to gain. Maybe Renly thought he could convince Stannis not to, but even Renly knows that's not true. Renly knows his brother Stannis is not going to back down. Under no circumstances is that going to happen. So, I don't know. I just don't... If I'm Renly, I would not have gone there. I think Renly's counselors gave him bad advice on that one. Just like how Aegon or Dany could be considered Aegon the Conqueror Reborn, the same could be said for Drogon being exactly Ghost. I think those are very good points. All right. Either way, we see Renly go there, and like we've been talking about this whole stream, Renly and Stannis, they were just set up to never be able to make a compromise in this situation. They're just too different. They're two vastly different people that they're never going to come to terms on anything. I mean, just look at their outlooks of life. Stannis is very much worried about his duty, worried about the things that need to be done, not about things like clothing, not about being popular with people. The two fundamentally could not come to one side, in my opinion. And we get one of the most iconic moments, one of my favorite moments, is the Renly's Peach situation. It just shows what is missing in Stannis' life. Stannis does not have enjoyment to where Renly does. And that's just a big thing between the two. I agree, Paul. I agree. Though Renly's ascension would set a bad precedent for every more popular... That is true. That's the problem with this system, Jordan. That is the problem. If Renly did take King's Landing, do you think Tywin would have accepted Robb's terms of peace? That's a great question. I think he would have had to. Matthew, that's a great question. And I think Tywin would have accepted terms of peace. Because at that point, Tywin now needs to figure out what he's doing with Renly. And if he can even get a ceasefire with Robb, I think that would have worked out best. That is cool, though, Leo. I don't have any siblings, so I cannot relate. Tywin, I agree. I think Tywin would fight to the end, but I could see Tywin making a peace pact to then fight Renly instead. But Renly, preparing to defeat his brother, is slain by a shadow baby, and thus ends Renly Baratheon. And Renly does have a bit of a legacy, right? He is remembered quite fondly by people. We see this idea of Renly's ghost at Blackwater. We see, again, this idea of a song being sang about Renly at the Purple Wedding. So again, it kind of really hammers in the nail that people loved Renly as a person. Like, people, the common person liked Renly and looked on him fondly in history, which is something I think is going to be very interesting when we look at characters like Stannis. I don't think people will remember Stannis fondly, even though I think Stannis is going to do something that is a big sacrifice against the others. I don't think he's going to be remembered fondly. Whereas Renly, even by the people he was going against, even in their courts, is still remembered pretty well. And one of my last notes here is that Loras buries Renly somewhere the two had known when he was a squire, so his remains would be unmolested, because again, you would have a lot of people trying to parade him around, like his body, just like with Stannis' body, and I think Loras was just trying to avoid that, because Loras did and genuinely, I think, care about Renly. We also know that Tiana, so this is like Cersei's informant for Marjorie, basically. She doubts that Renly never slept with Marjorie. I would be interested to know, like, do you guys think that Renly had ever slept with Marjorie? Personally, I don't think he ever did, but I'd be interested to see what you guys think on that. And also, another last funny thing that we see in Feast is that Tommen names one of Cersei's ships that she has made Renly, like Lord Renly. Very interesting. Tywin and Robin, an uneasy alliance with Tywin as king of the Rock to avenge Ned and Cersei is an interesting idea. Agreed. That would be a very interesting alliance. I don't know if it would be an alliance, Joel. More so, it would be a ceasefire. Like, they just would not attack each other. And then Rob would basically just conciliate, right? Or he would basically just not go to war with anybody. I don't think he would start a war with Renly. I think he would not see any point of that, and he would just kind of go back to either River Run or go back to the north. Or I think actually no, he would go to River Run and prepare just in case Tywin won and that war resumed. If Renly had become king, there would have been a lot more highborns trying to get the throne, because if this guy who wasn't the heir could get... Yes, exactly. And that's the whole issue of, A, Renly's outlook, and 2, this idea of a king. That's the issue, right? Is that when you set rules and then someone breaks that rule, you now have a precedent for other people to break said rule. We see issues like that all throughout the story. That's what the story is mainly about, how bad this system is. We see this with, can a woman sit on the Iron Throne? We see that causing the Dance of the Dragons. That's going to be an issue probably with Dany later on. We see this idea of bastards. While they have some sort of blood claim, should they sit the throne? The Blackfire Rebellions. We see all of these kind of situations where people try to change the set law, and that's the reason the system just doesn't work. Howland and others were fake towards Brienne. I think Renly was fake towards her as well, which is sad because she loved him. I think Renly didn't like Brienne or anything like that, but I think Renly was genuinely doing her a kindness. That's the way I choose to believe it. But Renly could be bi. That is very possible as well. The only justification for Renly to usurp Stannis' throne would be because he had a following of the Red God. That's a good point. He could use that, okay, Stannis is not this person because of religion. I could see that as well. But that will conclude our stream that takes us all the way through Renly's life and kind of his lasting legacy. I hope you guys all enjoyed the stream. I hope you guys like kind of the newer format. I'm probably going to do a lot more of these streams in this kind of format just because it's what people seem like they wanted. So, yeah, I will see you guys all in the next stream. And I hope you guys all have a wonderful week. I'll see you guys all next video or stream.